I just know you're going to love the guests that we have on in this episode, so don't go away. Welcome to the interview. I'm Dr. Rick Waj, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you a wonderful author as well as a brilliant man that I've just become acquainted with, David Bernstein. He's the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. Bernstein served as the president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, executive director of the David Project, many of you know. He also held senior roles with the American Jewish Committee, as well as having been a leading advocate for Israel's quest for peace and security on the legislative, diplomatic, media, and intergroup relations fronts. He's the author of this fascinating book that I've been reading called Woke Anti-Semitism. David, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you. Thanks so much.
And great to have you on. I mean, I consider it very, very timely, seeing what the world is going through right now. And so I have questions, but I'd like you to share with me what was the reason that you wrote Woke Anti-Semitism?
Well, I've been an active participant and leader in the Jewish community my entire life, my entire career. I've been in the Jewish advocacy world, and I've watched with dismay as this ideology has caught on, first, of course, in the academic world, then surprisingly in the corporate world where I first encountered it, and then in numerous other institutions in American life, not least the Jewish community. And I started feeling that this ideology was problematic in a number of ways. One, it absolutely shut down discourse. You know, we live in a complex, pluralistic society. We need to be able to talk to each other. And this discourse, this ideology made it what I'll call woke ideology, but we can define that in a minute if you'd like. Woke ideology made it impossible for people to talk to each other. It shut down conversation. It generated cancel culture, which we are all now, unfortunately, intimately familiar with. And it did another thing, and that was to foment anti-Semitism. When you have an ideology that tells you exactly who the oppressors are and exactly who the oppressed are with absolute certainty, it's not a far cry from saying Jews or Israel are the oppressors. It just doesn't take much to go there. It provides a permission structure for this type of anti-Semitism. And we're seeing that in all sorts of ways. Anybody who was had been paying attention to conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza over the last 15 years could not help but notice how crazy things got in May in 2021 and the last round of conflict. I had been monitoring this for a long time. I'd always done the reports and looked at how American media was covering the conflict. And I always noticed that in the beginning of the conflict, they always gave Israel the benefit of the doubt. And as the casualties mounted, as it got a little bit ugly sometimes, 3, 4, 5 days into it, the mainstream media would be calling for an immediate cease of hostilities. This time, in May 2021, it was from the get-go. Israel was considered the oppressor state just because it had more weapons than the people who had instigated the conflict. And so that, to me, was a red flag. This had really boiled over and that we had to do something about it. And it was not enough to pretend that the ideology didn't exist or wasn't fueling anti-Semitism. We had to name the ideology. If we can't name it, then we can't fight it.
I would say amen. I mean, everything you've just said is absolutely true. And Israel's always seen as being the oppressor, always wrong, and always stopped before they can actually stop those that are attacking them from being able to do it again and again and again. And, God bless Israel for trying to appease the world in the sense of showing themselves to be a righteous nation, doing the right thing. Because, they're not perfect, of course. There's no nation that's perfect, no human agency that's perfect. but I think Israel goes above and beyond what any other country I've seen in any type of war or conflict. And so it's amazing the way that the left media frames things about Israel.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think many have bought into this binary worldview, and they conflate success with power or unmitigated power. They conflate lack of success with oppression, and they're likely to continue to see Israel through this. That's why it's not enough for us just to challenge what they're saying. We have to challenge the underlying ideology. One
Yes.
of the things that I found in writing this book is that too many American Jewish leaders know about left-wing anti-Semitism. They'll call it out. They'll call it out when Ilhan Omar
Oh, sure.
or Rashid Tlaib makes a
Yes.
anti-Semitic statement. But what they're not doing is connecting the dots between the rise of this form of anti-Semitism, the rise of anti-Zionism, and this underlying woke ideology. And if you
Mhm.
wouldn't mind, Rick, I'm going to define it for a second.
Yes, please.
Woke ideology holds two core tenets. One is that bias and oppression are not just a matter of personal attitude, they're not just a matter of personal prejudice, but they're embedded in the very systems and structures of society. They're in the air that we breathe. That's number one. Number two is that only people with lived experience of oppression have the insight and the qualification to define it for the rest of society.
Of course.
Right. Now, both of those things can have some insight. It's true sometimes that bias and oppression are embedded in structures of society. In Jim Crow America, you could argue that America was a white supremacist state in many ways, but that's not the America that we live in today.
Exactly. And it's not the full picture either. Just
It's not the
because the
full
person
picture.
who's been through trauma can have a perspective that others may not have who've not been through trauma, it doesn't mean they hold all the information upon trauma.
Exactly. As a Jewish person who's experienced some anti-Semitism, I might have some insight that you should hear me out on, right? But that doesn't mean I have the absolute authority to dictate my perspective to everybody else. I'm struck by a Pew survey of Americans that held that Americans admire Jews more than any other religious community. I have to balance that out against my own perspective, my own experiences. It's a data point. My experiences are a data point, and the Pew survey is a data point, and we should be able to discuss all of those things. I don't get an
Yes.
unqualified ability to set the tone for the rest of society. Nobody
Right.
does.
Right.
We live in a society, I call it a classically liberal society, small L liberal society, where people get to discuss and debate their differences of opinion. We have to maintain that. And that's what's being lost in this current woke moment. And that's what I'm pushing back against. I want to be able to talk to people who have differences of opinion with me without being
Yes.
called a racist, without being called a misogynist, without being called a white supremacist, without being accused of having or talking out of privilege. That's just not the way to have societal conversations.
Yes. And as a white male in America, if there was ever prejudice these days, it's toward exactly that gender and that Caucasian. And it's amazing because even in our network, not being Jewish, but supporting the Jewish people and the Jewish cause, we have been shut down over so many networks just because of that viewpoint. So you're absolutely right. And your book is timely because where has discussion gone?
Yeah.
Where's
And Rick,
differing opinions gone?
Right. I want to note that I do still think that there's anti-Black prejudice out there. There's racism in certain places. I think we owe it to society to continue to root it out wherever it rears its ugly head. I see. I'm sure there are police departments where there's still some embedded institutional racism that should be ended, but that doesn't mean all police are institutionally racist.
Right.
And we've got, and I think the vast majority are not, and we shouldn't tarnish our law enforcement in that way. So those are the kinds of things that I want to be able to discuss. People can have slightly different opinions. Maybe some people think there's more racism than I do. Fine. Let's talk about it. Maybe some people think there's less than I do. That's fine too. Let's be in discussion.
I agree. I mean, we're all individuals. We've all had different experiences. We've all come to different conclusions based upon experience, learning, education. And yet, if we can't share those things, how will we ever widen our viewpoint?
Right.
I have a few questions, and I
Sure.
think it might push you in an area to help people understand why this book is so important. So, in your book, you write, and I found this actually on the website. Here's the quote: "Micro cancellations short circuit authentic self-expression and result in fear-invoked self-censorship." So here it is. So explain how censoring others ultimately is a censorship of oneself.
Yeah. So what happens is that you either got stifled yourself, someone basically maybe called you a racist outright, or maybe insinuated what you were saying was racism. You heard from somebody else express themselves in a certain way and then be lectured to in a very snarky way. And before you know it, you just don't want to do that anymore. You just don't want to express your opinion because you don't want people to censure it in that way. Now, that may be only coming from 10% segment of society. It may be that your wider social network would never do that to you. But all it takes is 1 out of 10 people in a gathering to call you out for you to go underground. We recently did a poll. The Jewish Institute for Liberal Values did a poll of 1,600 likely voters. And we found, and we've seen this in other polls as well, that Americans are self-censoring at record levels. They just don't want to alienate anyone, and they're resentful about it. People are self-censoring now at higher rates than they were during the McCarthy era in the United States in the 1950s. That's how much they're self-censoring, because they don't want to alienate people. And I think this is a very dangerous development. It's not healthy for democracy, and it breeds resentment. So when people feel resentful for being censored, they take it out at the polls. They take it out in their politics. It breeds a politics of anger on all sides. So one of the key things that we have to do as Americans, as American Jews, especially since I'm writing about American Jews as well, is we've got to model what it's like to be courageous again. And I don't mean courageous as in speaking against a totalitarian government that might end up in the putting you in the gulag. I'm talking about just experiencing a little bit of censure from some of your friends. You'll get past it. You know, there are a lot of people who resent this, who don't like being told what to think. They just simply go underground. And I think part of what we have to do is sort of bring them out of the woodwork, help encourage them to speak up, give them the tools and the language to speak up. One of my favorite phrases for people to use is, I think about that differently. It's actually a lot easier to say that than it is, I disagree with you, which can be immediately viewed as harsh or or snarky. No, just say, I think about it differently. Explain how you think about it differently. Are they going to really tell you that you can't think about it differently? So, I think we've got to help people find the courage to say things like that and then express their authentic view.
Yeah, I guess the term is.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the term is chutzpah.
Chutzpah, right. Chutzpah means just a little courage or having a little guts to say what's on your mind. We all need a little bit of chutzpah, not so much chutzpah where we shut everybody else down, but enough chutzpah to express how we really think about important issues facing society.
Yes, I agree 100%. So here's something I experienced actually growing up. And so that forms this question. Here's the question. So has the public educational system failed in its attempt to end segregation and stereotyping by promoting scholastic groups formed by ethnicity?
Yeah, so there's this idea of affinity groups, like white affinity groups, black affinity groups. It's not limited to public schools, although you're seeing it in some public schools. There's a woman I'm friends with who's been active in my organization named Nicole Levitt. She's an Orthodox Jew who lives in Philadelphia, and her job in this nonprofit is to defend women who have experienced domestic violence and abuse. She was asked by her workplace as part of a diversity initiative in her workplace to sign a statement that all white people are racist, and I'm no exception, and to participate in a white affinity group, which was an exercise in taking responsibility for their complicity in white supremacy. By the way, she was also censured for even raising the problem of anti-Semitism in a diversity discussion. And so she's filed a legal complaint that's before the EEOC now. What I'm telling you this is not to dodge the question about schools. It's happening in schools, but it's happening in work life as well. We're putting people into these affinity groups by race. I was talking to a woman in Boston, an Asian woman, who said, she's put into an Asian affinity group, which made her laugh because she said, "What do I have in common with an Iranian American? I mean, my experience is completely different, but yet because we're both Asian, we're both in the Asian affinity group." And I have to laugh because my mom is a Jew from Baghdad, Iraq. And if my 23andMe score is that I'm 50.4% Western Asian. So I said I could be in your Asian affinity group as well. It just shows you the absurdity of these exercises and dividing people. And somehow they think dividing people into these affinity groups, they're going to end racial discrimination. I don't think so. I think
it
just
causes
breeds resentment. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I was in middle school before even going into high school, and they had already created Black student unions, white student unions, Asian student unions, Filipino student union, the whole thing. We didn't know we were different until they formed those groups, and I couldn't be in their group and they couldn't be in mine. Right. They have a big role to play in causing divisions between ethnicity.
Right. Yeah. And it's tough because, people can associate with each other and they can do so around their own cultural proclivities, their own beliefs. That's why we have different religions in this country as well. But what this does, what you might call identity politics does, is it creates sort of a permanent set of grievance in society. And it says, not only do I affiliate with a certain tribe or ethnicity, which is fine, we all have our own cultural backgrounds, but that because of that, I also have a claim against American society. I'm being oppressed. And I realized that in many ethnic communities, they're not sure whether they should embrace this or not. I spoke not too long ago at a Chinese American gathering, large group of people. And somebody asked me about the current state of pluralism in America. And I said to them, "Do you feel like you're an oppressed group? Because I don't, and I don't think you're oppressed either. Do you believe that America is an oppressive state? Because I don't. It's not perfect. There's discrimination, but do you believe that is that the message that you want to send your kids and your grandkids, that America is an oppressive state, that the country you fled from, China, is like the country that you fled to is like the country you fled from?" And I got practically a standing ovation. I couldn't leave the hall after I said that, because they understand that this Russian narrative is not good for them and good for their kids. So they're getting together as Chinese Americans, but really they're people who they love America. They know that America offers unparalleled opportunity for them and their kids, and they do want to take full advantage of it. So I think that's the difference between identity and identity politics. And I think, unfortunately, these days we see a lot of identity politics.
I agree, 100%. So do you think because of this narrative that says there's only one right answer and it must be mine, that even in the form of religion, that limits us so much so that being in a nation, a world really today, that's has a lack of theocentric worldview, values among non-religious people, that it lends itself to anti-Semitism?
Yes, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure tell me if I'm interpreting it correctly, but as organized religion has sort of receded from public life in America, and you can see this in the polls, have become less religious in the past couple decades. What you're seeing is a kind of secular religion replace traditional
Yes.
religion. But that secular religion, which one form is wokeism, it's not the only form of secular religion, is not nearly as calibrated to democratic life as, let's say, Christianity and Judaism are. Christianity and Judaism have found their place within the democratic ethos of American society, and they understand that they have that each has a voice in how we live our lives, but we also have to live part of a larger society with different religious traditions and be able to live in peace together. What wokeism does is it claims to have a monopoly on the truth, and it's not calibrated to democratic life. It tells you that if you don't agree with me, then you're a heretic,
Yes.
and that's extremely destructive. It's very hard to live with people who believe that anybody who disagrees with them are heretics. And what it does is it breeds a resentment from people who aren't woke. So
Yes.
if you're white people living, let's say, in a manufacturing town that's really hit hard times, and there's an opioid epidemic, and you really don't have great job prospects, and you're being told by somebody that you enjoy white privilege, I that's going to create a kind of identity politics among those people who are going to also now feel that they're being oppressed. The kind of vicious cycle that this creates, and creates a grievance cycle not only on the left but also on the right. Now the right says, "Well, I'm aggrieved. You're imposing your views on me. You're imposing your way of life on me," and that causes really damage to our sense of self as a nation, our narrative, our collective narrative as a nation. And I think we've got to start
Yes.
pushing back against that, because we don't want it on either side of the political spectrum.
Right. One of the sad things we're seeing through this woke advent that's taking place around the world, really, not just in America, is the implementation of that paradigm within the higher educational system. And so here we have these young people being influenced with this mindset that proposes itself to be correct and everything else is wrong, which again is an effect upon anybody's religious views, because if they don't have that secular worldview of leftist wokeism, then they must be incorrect, and they must be being prejudiced themselves. It makes no sense.
It makes no sense, and it just breeds an awful lot of anger among people. Look, I think higher education, that's going to be a tough nut to crack. If I think of all the institutions that have been sort of captured by this ideology, the one I'm least optimistic about reclaiming is higher education, because it's become just so pervasive in university circles. Now, I'm aware of the fact that there are more than 4,000 institutions of higher learning in this country, the vast majority of which are, community colleges where people drive to learn a skill set and what have you. So we're not seeing this in equal measure everywhere, but we're seeing it in the more elite colleges and in the humanities. So you could be an engineering student in Michigan and maybe not as indoctrinated, but you're not far away from people who are. And I think that's a problem. And those people go on and they become bureaucrats in our nation's government. They become business leaders. They become nonprofit leaders. They start teaching people how to decolonize data and other absurdities like that. I mean, the number of absurdities we're seeing in the workplace today, it just is mind-boggling. That you have
Yes.
workplaces that are just trying to either turn a profit, or they're trying to create a better staff culture, or they're trying to come up with a new strategic plan, and they've bought into all this nonsense that is just completely taking them off the mark. And I don't know how that doesn't provoke a backlash, but so far it hasn't. So, what that does in the future, what Americans are going to continue to stand for, I'm not sure yet.
You basically read my mind on you answered the question I hadn't even asked yet. How in the world does this benefit any corporation by being so polarized that they are rejecting part of their people that are buying their products? It makes no sense. It really
Yeah,
does not.
it doesn't make sense, and you have to sort of look under the hood a bit to understand how it's happened and what's gone wrong. Um, First of all, a lot of corporations needed or wanted diversity, equity, inclusion programs because they wanted to mitigate against lawsuits and discrimination, and it protected them against charges that they were engaged in discrimination when it was a discrimination lawsuit. Over time, of course, they hired consultants who had a worldview, who had this sometimes neo-Marxist worldview, and those people trained people to look at the world in a certain way. The other thing that happened is in the wake of the George Floyd murder,
Hmm.
many corporations sort of signed on the dotted line. And they
Yeah.
said, okay, we're going to become an anti-racist organization, whatever that means. And they deferred to other people to determine what their attitudes were on these issues. And as a result, it becomes very hard to get out of that once you sort of sign on the dotted line. You've now said that other people get to decide for you what you think about all kinds of political and social issues. So now you're sort of stuck with that original decision that you made,
Because if you
deferring
pull
to
out of
them.
that, then obviously you have prejudice.
You've empowered certain people within your own company. You've hired new people in your own company to decide things for you. Very hard to get out of. That's
Yes.
going to be the biggest challenge. It's very possible that the political winds start to change here, and that we start to see, and I think we're already seeing, a thawing of some of this discourse. That yet institutions that originally committed themselves to this remain captured for a lot longer. That institutions are way downstream from politics in this way.
Yes. We have like a minute and a half left in this show. I want to make sure that people know where they can find and buy your book, Woke Anti-Semitism. So help us.
So you can find it on Amazon. Just type in woke anti-Semitism. It's only on Amazon for the time being. It's on both Kindle and softcover book. I'm happy to talk to other groups, by the way, about the book. We didn't get deep into woke anti-Semitism itself and how it causes anti-Semitism and how it treats Jews in Israel as being part of the privileged class. We touched upon it, and I invite you to sort of further your listeners and readers to read it and to further delve into that. And I'm happy to talk to anybody about it as well. I think it's an important topic, and I think this is one of the great challenges that we face in American society today.
And so you're willing to have dialogue, not just have your own perspective. I mean,
Absolutely. That's
can
what
you
it needs
imagine?
now. Yeah, can you imagine? And I might be wrong. The only way I know I'm wrong is if I talk to very thoughtful people who give me alternative views and
Yes.
challenge me. That's how I learn. One thing about being Jewish that I always appreciated, and it's not in equal measure in every Jewish house, is that we debated around the Shabbat table. We debated all kinds of issues, and I do that with my kids every Friday night during Shabbat. I raise an issue to discuss, and whatever point of view they're taking, I take the opposite point of view. I do devil's advocate, and that helps them create rigorous thinking skills. And I
Yes.
look, and because with all the craziness we have in society, they need to be very thoughtful and smart kids if they're going to be able to handle what comes before them. And so that's part of what we need to go back to. Not that we don't have to debate in a nasty way. We can but be able to exchange points of view and be thoughtful
Yes.
about it in the process.
I agree. David Bernstein, thank you so much for being on the show. Uh, Friends, I highly recommend this book. It's brilliantly written. It brings the conversations of the progressive left's woke agenda into a common sense analysis and its destructive consequences upon society today. Really highly recommend you get David Bernstein's book, Woke Anti-Semitism. You'll be glad that you read it. It's amazing. Thank you,
Thanks a
David,
lot.
so much.
Be well.
Okay, you too.